One of the subjects that Paul writes to the Corinthians about on a number of occasions is to do with the matter of giving, what in modern ways of speaking we call the collection. Now, it can be a sensitive area and is not often touched upon, but it appears that the Corinthians had actually written to Paul about it because the subject is introduced with the formula "now concerning" in chapter 16 verse 1. We have previously seen that these words appear to be an indicator of matters that were included in a letter that they wrote to him, and that's the letter that's referred to in chapter 7 and verse 1. Now, most of the material that Paul wrote on this subject of giving is in 2 Corinthians, but today we are going to read 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verses 1 to 3. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week let every one of you lay by him in store as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. And when I come, whomsoever ye shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. When Paul writes about the collection for the saints in verse 1, it would only be fair to point out that he's referring to the specific collection that he exhorted the Gentile churches in general to make for their Jewish brethren and sisters. He refers to a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem in Romans chapter 15 verse 26. And that was one of the reasons why he was keen to return to Jerusalem at the end of his third missionary journey. After many years I came to bring alms to my nation, he says in Acts chapter 24 verse 17. This idea of the Gentiles contributing to the Jews was one of the ways in which Paul sought to bind Jewish and Gentile believers together in the bonds of Christ. It's an important principle for us to follow. But while that is the case, we can draw out more general principles about contributing towards the support of the Lord's people and the support of God's work from these verses. Does it not seem reasonable that the way in which this is done should reflect the way in which this particular collection was made? Now, this week we're going to explore some things relevant to how it should be done, and then next week I'm going to take the liberty of reflecting on some things that perhaps we ought to avoid as far as the collection is concerned. Now, the first thing that I want to say is that Paul indicates that his instructions are the same as he gave to other companies of the Lord's people. As I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye, he says in verse 1. Now, this was not for special, specific Corinthian circumstances, but for the general situation. When he goes on to write upon the first day of the week in verse 2, he indicates a regular, organised collection of funds to be carried out weekly. That it was on the first day of the week ties it to the day that the believers gathered together, and there probably were no midweek meetings in the first century anyway. And so first day of the week made it convenient for the believers to actually contribute to the offering. They had come together. Now, Paul also writes, let every one of you lay by him in store in verse 2. Now, the idea is simply to regularly set aside an amount for this purpose. In the modern world, this could be done using a box or a piggy bank, or even by setting up a separate bank account specifically for the purpose of the Lord's work, so that you don't dip into it for ordinary expenses. Each should set aside as God hath prospered him, verse 2. Now, he doesn't command a tithe, but according to the means and willingness of the individual. In fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 12, Paul explains it this way: according to that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not. I suppose the challenge to us should be, when we earn a little extra, who gets it? Do I spend that extra on myself, or is that extra for the Lord? Now, in verse 3 then of chapter 16, we learn about the handling of the collection. Whomsoever ye shall approve, Paul writes in verse 3. The Corinthians were to appoint a plurality of people, not just one man, to handle the money, and were to choose people who had demonstrated their trustworthiness. They were approved. You see, the use of reliable people was a safeguard so that the Corinthians could be assured that the gift actually was delivered to the intended recipients. Paul believed in checks and safeguards in the handling of the Lord's money, and of course so should we. Are there procedures then that we should avoid when gathering for the Lord's work? Well, I'm going to touch on a few of those things next week in the will of the Lord.